Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and with today's update we have a buff to a specialization of rogues that has been kind of abandoned by a good portion of the community. We got buffs for Assassination Rogue. These buffs are actually to be combined with the cumulative buffs from like a week or two ago that Assassination has gotten, which might actually make the spec possibly viable. There's actually quite a bit of hype from the Assassination Rogue community where the spec might actually be not that bad. And I wanted to take a look at it immediately as soon as the Tuesday updates happened, to take a look at the spec, to play around with it, to see if it feels any different or plays any differently. But it looks like maybe we might be seeing a small return of Assassination Rogues going forward for Shadowlands. While not anything crazy, game-changing, or potentially meta-changing, I believe that anybody playing Assassination will like this slight leg up in terms of being more viable for a variety of content. So first of all, let's take a look at overall what are the buffs that happened for Assassination. So with this recent Tuesday/Wednesday for EU update for the classes, Assassination Rogues have gotten an 8% damage buff. Prior to this, about a week or actually two, maybe even three ago at this point, there was also another buff for a variety of different specs that are getting buffed this week, and Assassination was amongst those specs, receiving a 5% tuning buff for the playstyle. This combined together, the 5 plus 8%, forms together a cumulative 13% buff for the spec since the beginning of Shadowlands. Now, a 13% buff sounds better than a 5% or an 8%. So that's overall what we ended up getting with rogues in the recent few updates. Now, something to note is this is an aura buff. Now, the way that auras work is they amplify the damage output of a variety of rogue abilities, but that's really about it. Past the abilities like Mutilate, Garrote, Rupture, Envenom, it doesn't buff things like auto attacks, for example. So while this isn't a direct 13% increase, it's more like a 12 or maybe 11.75% increase, because auto attacks is quite a huge portion of the Assassination Rogue damage in a long scheme of things, particularly for single target fights in a raid boss situation. However, this is still quite a nice buff to a variety of damage and abilities. It doesn't change the structure of the damage either. It doesn't make certain dots or certain specific abilities stronger, rather a whole toolkit is just slightly stronger with a small tuning. The reason this buff is significant, and the reason a lot of Assassination Rogues should be excited, is on the Rogue Discord, and I mentioned this earlier in a couple of videos ago, that apparently over with the Theory Crafters, they were looking at Assassination maybe getting a 13% buff in order to be viable, which puts it in a better position than a spec that's not even considered. Prior to this buff, Assassination as a playstyle and damage output in PvE just wasn't feasible. While a fun playstyle, it just didn't really amount to a competitive number, at least in comparison with the other classes. And there's a variety of different specs and playstyles, especially even in the Rogue class already, where you already have far more powerful options to pick from, and it just made it that much harder to justify bringing an Assassination Rogue for a variety of PvE content. So how does this spec play? I wanted to test it out, and we ran into a 16 Terna Scythe in order to really put the spec through its paces. Also got to kill 2 bosses on Mythic as this spec as well to really give it a go. However, before we talk about damage, let's talk about the playstyle, because that will feel different if you're someone who is new to Rogue, or if you're someone who is not new to Rogue and wants to give the spec a spin. It does feel a little different. The spec for the most part is the same. You still have Ruptures, Garrotes, Envenoms. However, Slice and Dice, while it's just one extra buff for you to manage, does complicate the rotation a little bit. It just feels like you never have enough common points or energy to maintain everything. And at most, you can have enough energy to maintain your dots, maintain Slice and Dice, but you feel like you're missing out on some Envenom windows. So better gear and being able to stat your character a little bit better with more haste will definitely help, but that's going to be a long journey for a while. So this spec you will really have to have some gear commitment into. But how does it perform? I felt like first of all, let's talk about raids, and let's talk about my setup. I'm running mostly lack of haste gear, but anything that sims the best for my character, and I'm also running a legendary at 190 item level for now, until I can upgrade it to better. A legendary where my character is able to do more damage below 30% of enemy's health with your poisons as well as your bleeds. It's like an execute legendary back from Legion, and it works out really well. I can totally see Assassination Rogues being able to cheese some free damage, especially during those big bursty Vendetta windows, which are still a real thing. So overall, I would say for single target raid fights, I feel like the spec is definitely not terrible if you're going to be doing heroics. I feel like the spec can have some moments in Mythic raids, but it is very difficult for me to say with confidence that this spec will 100% be replacing Subtlety and Outlaw as the meta spec for the raiding environment. If you are in a guild that isn't going for top 100, I could totally see Assassination Rogues slaying the Nathrias in hundreds, maybe. I think it's totally possible, totally doable. However, with raid environment where there's just not too many melee spots, and if you are a melee, you want to be doing top damage. And I just don't think Assassination at the moment has the ability to reach that kind of top damage numbers of what Unholy Death Knights can do and Windwalkers, where Outlaw, Rogue, and Subtlety actually could have somewhat of a competitive output. But maybe we just haven't figured out the best build for Assassination for raids, so I may be proven wrong in the future. As for Mythic Pluses, I feel like this is where the spec has opportunities. While rogues are not the top DPS by any measure, you're gonna have fire mages blasting people, you're gonna have even demon hunters as tanks blasting people. There's quite a lot of classes right now when it comes to especially the range that can do a lot of AoE damage output, and their damage can literally carry dungeons. This isn't quite BFA where Outlaw Rogue literally carried everyone's damage inside of keys, but I feel like Assassination, in comparison to Outlaw, in comparison to Subtlety, isn't really super far off. Rogues are there for the utility of Shroud, but also the utility of Saps, Garrotes, which will be one of the unique utilities of this spec, Cheap Shots, as well as Shiv and Poisons, because we do have Numbing Poison, which can help kind of numb the enemy bosses to swing a little bit slower at our tanks and cast spells a little bit slower. So rogues in particular don't really have that bad of a setup, almost no matter which spec you play with. I think Outlaw does have some advantages in Mythic Pluses because of its consistent damage, but Outlaw kind of lacks the burst output. Subtlety has a lot of bursty damage, but it's very much tied to cooldowns. Assassination, I feel like, is a very interesting spot where you have the dot damage, and because of the Garrote playstyle, you can actually go for some crazy cleaves on 2-3 targets. So being able to get opener bleeds on everybody can give you quite a bit of pressure. Assassination also has a very consistent AoE damage output with the right talent setup, where you can go for a bunch of Crimson Tempests and a bunch of bleeds on a variety of enemies, and you'll deal quite high sustained AoE damage. When it comes to boss fights, that's where Vendetta comes in. On a very short cooldown, you're able to kind of burst an enemy down, and the damage you do in Vendetta is actually quite significant. Think of old school Vendetta window burst opportunities that Assassins had in the last expansion, and that's basically what we still have now, where I feel like this is why, because of this variety of different toolkits, from the consistent AoE damage to the multi-dotting to the ability to burn something down with a massive Vendetta window, very similar to a Fire Mage with Combustion, minus all that cleave AoE that goes on. I feel like it actually has an opportunity to maybe make some plays. And I want to say that inside of Mythic Pluses, because of the ability for you to have more than 5 targets that you can AoE, the consistent AoE allows you to actually have quite good damage throughout a dungeon run. I will say I didn't get as high of damage as I normally get on Outlaw, but I am in that ballpark and with really bad gear. So if I were to just polish up my setup, get myself the best in slot stats in gear, and make sure my enchants and everything head to toe is good, I think we actually could see some competitive numbers out of Assassination in some way. And that's where I think Assassination might actually be able to shine to some extent. I do still think that Subtlety and Outlaw might overshadow it, but not nearly as much, as Assassination does have a very unique profile in terms of the damage it outputs. And it's not bad damage at all either, and I think it actually could be a decent choice depending on your group composition. The one thing I will say that's kind of awkward for Assassination player, at least when I played my Assassination Rogue inside of a Mythic Plus with a Fire Mage, as well as an Affliction Warlock, which are two classes very much tied to their cooldowns, me also being tied to Vendetta on single target, just made us all about burst. So you on first boss to turn a scythe that you're supposed to phase, and then supposed to DPS the second boss while he is stunned for extra damage. I actually had to burn my Vendetta in order for us to get through the first boss with everybody holding cooldowns. This wouldn't happen on Outlaw because of all that consistent damage output. So I feel like it can sometimes have a bit of clash in terms of the different classes and playstyles it may or may not complement. But it is super fun in Mythic Pluses, and I feel like this is where it is a lot more effective, at least in comparison to the raid environment. Again, gear does make a pretty big difference, but it definitely felt pretty cool and fun to play Assassination within M+. Anyway, that's gonna be me gushing about Assassination. I think the buffs are nice, and I wonder how many people are gonna go back to playing Assassination, because there were a lot of Assassination mains in the last expansion. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think about the buffs, and I'll see all of you in the next one.